And Florida Democratic Congresswoman Lois Frankel tweets, with less than 12 hours left to avoid a government shutdown, it's time for Congress to come together. This is no way to run the government. Next, we'll get a look at how the Senate will proceed as the chamber gavels in with live coverage from the Senate floor right here on C-SPAN 2.
The whirlwind. May they remember that all that is necessary for unintended catastrophic consequences is for good people to do nothing. Lord, lead them away from the unfortunate dialectic of us versus them as they strive to unite for the common good of this land we love. Let them not be content to wait and see what will happen, but give them the determination to make the right things happen. Bless them with the courage to stand for something, lest they fall for anything. We pray in your merciful name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., September 30th, 2013. To the Senate, under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Richard J. Durbin, a senator from the state of Illinois, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Patrick J. Leahy, President pro tempore.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I ask the chair lay before the Senate a message from the House with respect to H.J. Res. 59.
The chair lays before the Senate the following message from the House.
Resolved that the House agree to the amendment of the Senate to the resolution H.J. Res. 59 entitled Joint Resolution Making Continuing Appropriations for Fiscal Year 2014 and for Other Purposes with amendments to the Senate amendment.
Mr. President, I move to table the House amendments and ask for the yeas and nays on my motion.
Is there a sufficient second? Sufficient second is noted. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. No. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Bekich. Mr. Bennett. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chiesa. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly.
Yeah, she probably wants this. Thank you.
Mr. Durbin.
Aye.
Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Sure. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative. Baldwin, Baucus, Beckich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Coons, Donley, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Levin, Manchin, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Stabenow, Udall of Colorado, Warner, Warren, and Wyden. Senators voting in the negative. Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Chiesa, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Corker, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Graham, Hatch, Hoeven, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Lee, McConnell, Murkowski, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Scott, Sessions, Thune, Toomey, Vitter, and Wicker. Mr. Coates? Mr. Coates? No. Mr. Blunt? No. Mr. Crapo? No. Mr. Bozeman? No. Mr. Rubio? Mr. Rubio? No. Mr. Paul? No. Mr. Moran? No. Mr. Grassley? Mr. Grassley? No. Mr. Hope? Mr. Heller? No. Mr. Shelby? No.
Mr. Burr? No. Mr. Tester? Aye. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island? Aye. Mr. Cornyn? Mr. Cornyn? No. Mr. Inhofe? Mr. Inhofe? No. Mr. Udall of New Mexico? Aye. Mr. Pryor? Aye. Mr. Kirk? No. Mr. McCain? No. Mr. Leahy? Aye. Mr. Whitehouse? Aye. Mr. Markey? Aye. Mr. Chambliss, no.
On this question, the ayes are 54, the nays are 46. The motion to table the House amendments to the Senate amendment to the House Joint Resolution 59 prevails. Majority Leader?
Quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Aya. Yeah. Ms. Baldwin.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
is it not consent to call the quorum be terminated?
Without objection.
Mr. President, I now ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to pre-morning business for debate only until 4 p.m. today, with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each, and that further, the time until 4 p.m. be equally divided between the two leaders or the designees, with I being recognized at 4 p.m. The first speaker I ask consent would be the Chairman of the Appropriations Committee, Senator Mikulski.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. Senator from Maryland.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, it would be, if the Senate would be in order, so we could have one conversation
Senator's
at
correct.
a time.
Senate will be in order. All senators having conversations, please take them out of the chamber. Senate will be in order. Senator from Maryland.
Well, Mr. President, we're at the brink. Hello?
Senate will be in order. Senators having conversations, please take them out of the chamber.
Well, Mr. President,
Senator from Maryland.
thank you. Well, we're at the brink. We're just hours away from a possible government shutdown. All over my state and all over the nation, there are very devoted federal employees who are wondering to hear, are they going to be called non-essential? Non-essential to performing important government services. Should they come in tomorrow? People who've applied for small business loans, are those loans going to be processed? People who've applied for student loans, are they going to be processed? What's going to happen to the Weather Service? What's going to happen at NIH? What's going to happen at the Food and Drug Administration, where people stand sentry over the safety of our food supply and our drug supply? Well, we don't know because we have just tabled the radical bill that the House sent over to us. It was deliberately designed to be politically provocative. Continuing resolutions were always about disputes over money. They were not about political, ideological viewpoints over past legislation. So I'm so glad that what we did just now was to table it and send it back to the House. The Senate acted very responsibly last week on a short-term continuing funding resolution, get rid of politically motivated riders, keep the government working for the American people until November 15th to work out our differences on funding bills. The House sent us back yet one more bill that says if you don't delay the Affordable Care Act for 1 year, we will shut down the government. If you don't eliminate the benefits affecting prevention and particularly women's health, we will shut down government. If the government shuts down tomorrow, it will be because of the House's viewpoint, my way or the highway. A government shutdown is a serious matter. If we don't come together across the aisle and across the dome and across the town to pass a clean, short-term, continuing resolution. Let me take a minute to highlight how damaging a government shutdown is to the day-to-day lives of our American people and our economy. Shutting down the federal government will have immediate and harmful consequences on our economy. Small Business Administration approval loans will be put on hold. 28 million American small businesses will no longer have access to federally assisted loans or technical assistance. In the rural areas, the USDA Rural Development Housing and Farm Loan and Grant Program will stop. Let's go to the safety of our waterways. The Army Corps of Engineers will stop work on all flood control and navigation projects. This is what helps ensure that our ships can travel through America's waterways, whether they're coming up the Chesapeake Bay into the Port of Baltimore, or they're traveling down the Mississippi or the Missouri or coming into the Gulf. The Department of Commerce will stop economic development, minority business, our international trade and assistance program. Now, I know that the House passed a separate amendment funding active duty military. Well, I would hope so. I would hope so. I mean, these are men and women who put themselves in the line of duty. But I also want to remind people that there are other people every day who are doing a job to protect the health, safety, and law enforcement of the American people. Mr. President, I represent all of the men and women who work at the Food and Drug Administration. It is headquartered in my state. 55%, or 2,000 people, will be furloughed at midnight. FDA will stop monitoring imports at our borders. At the center And what does that mean? For those men and women who we're going to tell are in session that they're non-essential, that if your job is to stand sentry over the food supply of the United States of America, you are non-essential. If you stand sentry over the safety of our drugs and our medical devices, we're telling you you're non-essential. I don't think the American people support that. They might be cranky a little bit about the federal government here or there, but I think they want their food to be safe, their drugs to be safe, and they want us to move ahead with these devices to make sure they're in clinical practice. Over at the National Institutes of Health, which is located in Bethesda, Maryland, the National Institutes of Health and their subsidiaries that receive extramural funding throughout the United States of America. 70% of the staff at NIH will be furloughed. 70% of the 10,000 men and women who work at NIH will be furloughed at midnight. These are the people working on the cure for Alzheimer's. They are working on the cure for autism. They are working on the cure for arthritis. I'm just going through the A words. We could go on to the B words. How about breast cancer? How about cancer itself? Last year, when the NIH announced that cancer rates in America had been reduced by 15%, instead of pinning medals on the people at NIH and the private sector who worked with us on important drugs and biological products, we announced sequester. What kind of government would destroy the very people, the very agency that's set up to come up with cures, or in the case of Alzheimer's, cognitive stretch out? 70%. And who are they? They're the lab technician people. They're the people who help run the administrative work that now enables those talented researchers to be able to do it. The NIH Clinical Center won't be able to admit new patients or start new clinical trials. The NIH Clinical Center is a hospital at NIH. You don't come in there unless you are really sick and unless you're really desperate and unless you really have no place to go. You come in with no hope. That's what they've nicknamed NIH around America. Not the National Institutes of Health, but the National Institutes of Hope. That somewhere what they're doing today is going to lead to solving your problem tomorrow. Why are we furloughing 70%? And not only are we furloughing them, we're saying bye-bye for now, you're non-essential. Well, I think they're crucial. I think they're not only essential, but I think they're crucial. So I don't worry about really what our priorities are. Then you go into the weather forecasters. Oh, they'll be on their job. They're located in my state, too. You might say, well, do you have any people work in the private sector? People in Maryland work in the private sector because of the public sector. Our law enforcement, our FBI, they'll be on the job. They're in the line of fire, too. But they'll be getting paid an IOU. Instead of IOU, we should say to the FBI and to our border control and to our marshals chasing sexual predators and human traffickers, not that I owe you, but we owe you a debt of gratitude. We owe you getting your pay on time. We shouldn't delay the fact that you haven't gotten a cost of living for 3 years, and we shouldn't be dancing around with ideological motivated shutdowns. Social Security checks will go out, but 18,000 people who visit a Social Security office will find that they're understaffed. On the average, 500,000 people call Social Security every day. They're going to get either no answer or a business signal. Mr. President, I could go on and on about what the consequences of a shutdown are. We really cannot do that. So I say to my colleagues on the other side of the dome, please, let's pass a clean CR. Let's pass it to November 15th. Let's negotiate on a middle ground number. They have a budget at $988 billion, and they accept sequester as the new normal. Let's find a way to cancel sequester, at least for 2 years. I marked up the appropriation bills at $1.058 trillion. That's what the Senate Budget Committee, that's the number that the Senate passed on its Budget Committee in April. There's a $70 billion difference. I'm ready to negotiate, but we can't capitulate. Let's find a middle ground. There was a great American general and a great statesman and a real American icon, Colin Powell. Over and over and over again, he would say during the Reagan administration, let's find that sensible center. Let's find that sensible center. Let's avoid a shutdown. Let's stop playing slam-down politics. Let's come together and find a way to solve the problem of keeping the government open now, but our long-term fiscal solution of paying down our government debt, I understand that, but also making sure we have a pro-growth budget that lowers the unemployment rate, raises the educational achievement. Find those cures for those diseases affecting the American people. Have an FDA that can get them approved, ensuring safety and efficacy in the hands of our doctors here and doctors all over the world. Let's make sure when we talk about American exceptionalism, we know where it comes from. Mr. President, I know I have other colleagues that wish to speak. I now yield the floor.
President?
Senator from Missouri.
Mr. President, I find the position we're in right now beyond frustrating, and I can imagine what the American people must be thinking right now. And it is very hard from a distance to figure out who has really lost their minds. One party, the other party, all of us, the President. But I really want to try to boil down what has occurred, because it's stunning when you boil it down. The House sent us a piece of legislation where they wanted to defund the health care reforms, Obamacare, in order, and that was the price they were demanding in order for the government to stay open. The ticket to admission for an open government was us getting rid of the health care bill. Well, we took that up, and we defeated it by a 10-vote margin, 54 to 44. We defeated that bill. And we sent it back to them, just the ticket to keep the government open, without an extra price of admission. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because what happened when we sent that back? Did they take it up and defeat it? No. No, they didn't vote. I want to make sure the American people understand this. All the members of Congress that were elected to serve the people of this country, they didn't get a chance to vote, because the Speaker decided there wouldn't be a vote of the House of Representatives on the Senate-passed measure. Now, and then somebody says, well, it's the Hastert rule. Well, I've searched the Constitution. I can't find the Hastert rule. It's not there. And so the question we have to ask right now is, why won't they let the House vote? Maybe they'll defeat a clean attempt just to keep the government open. And by the way, nobody here is against negotiating or compromise. We've compromised on the number in this continuing resolution, and we are perfectly willing. We have been desperately trying to negotiate and compromise on the budget for months. Senator Cruz has blocked our attempts to go to conference on the budget. So it's not that none of us are willing to compromise. Maybe some of us aren't. But there's a good, healthy, bipartisan margin of senators that want to compromise on issues surrounding federal spending, but not on keeping the government open and not on paying our bills. Let's get those done. Let's get those done. That's basic. Let's get it done. And so my plea today to Speaker Boehner is quit making decisions on behalf of all your members, a small group of you huddled in a back room, because that's what's happening. There's 2 or 3 men
in a back room down the hall, and they're deciding whether or not they're going to allow the elected representatives of this country to vote. Let the House vote. I think the American people may be surprised that there would be a healthy bipartisan margin to, in fact, keep the government open when the clock strikes midnight tonight. Elections matter. And elections are what dictate what happens around here. We had an election last November. I remember it very well. I stood for election last November. There were two candidates for President of the United States. And every American citizen had a chance to decide who they wanted to lead this country. And the contrast was very clear. One candidate said he was going to repeal Obamacare on the very first day he was president. He was going to, by executive order, wipe out Obamacare on day one. The other president said, I'm going to implement Obamacare. That president won, and it wasn't even close. Every single Democratic senator who ran for re-election and voted for Obamacare was re-elected. Red state, purple state, blue state, all of us were re-elected that voted for Obamacare. And in fact, a couple more were elected in states where Republicans had represented those states. We didn't lose seats, we picked up seats. And even in the House of Representatives, the raw votes, there were more Democratic votes cast in the House of Representatives than Republican votes. They have the majority because of the way the districts are drawn. But I understand they control that House, but should they control whether or not people get to vote? Let the House vote. Well, they say, but Obamacare is so unpopular. The American people don't want it. Now, I get that the polling is not good for this reform. And I am perfectly willing, as we implement it, if we need to make tweaks and changes to make it better, I hope my friends across the aisle will quit using this as a political 2x4 and help us make it as good as we can possibly make it. Because this isn't about any plot. This is about accessible and affordable health care for all Americans with a free market solution. These are all private insurance companies. There's not a government program in this. People are going to be able to choose between various private policies and various options. And they're never going to have to pay more than 9.5% of their income for their insurance. And the insurance companies aren't going to be able to swallow fat profits just for golden parachutes for big CEOs anymore. They're going to have to spend 80 cents of every dollar on your health care. But it's all free market. This was a Republican solution in the beginning. The candidate for president forgot that, former Governor Romney, that this was his solution in Massachusetts when he was governor. But I will give the Republicans this. It is unpopular in the polls right now. But let's take this proposition. Guess what background checks for guns polls right now? I know that the presiding officer painfully knows what those numbers are because of the tragedy in his state. It's much higher, frankly, than those who say they think Obamacare should be repealed, the Americans who support background checks on weapon purchases. So what would everyone think on the other side of the aisle if we just decided, well, you know, we're going to shut down the government if you won't pass background checks on guns? It's what the American people want. We'll just shut down the government if you won't pass it. That's not the way we legislate. That's not the constitutional framework our founding fathers put together. There would be outrage that we would try to shut down the government over background checks on guns. But yet, the very same premise would apply to what they're doing. There was an election. The president won. The majority of the Senate is, in fact, individuals who support this valiant attempt to try to do something with a health care system that was headed off the rails, becoming more and more unaffordable every day. And by the way, everything that's bad now is Obamacare. I laughingly made a joke in my state that our university's team didn't do very well on offense in the first half. I said it must be Obamacare. Because no matter what is out there that people are upset about, somehow they managed to paint it with the Obamacare brush. I think people are going to be pleasantly surprised. It's not going to be as intrusive as some of the talking heads have warned. It's going to provide a marketplace where people can pool risk and get a better deal. It's going to provide a lot more nights where parents can rest easy because they're not rolling the dice every day and depending on the emergency room for their day-to-day health needs. So my message today is very simple. All of this is premised on a notion that you should be able to shut down our government because you don't get your way in an election. I don't think that's the role model we want to serve to other governments in the world, much less to our kids. And I think we can compromise on a lot of things. We can even work on making this bill better. But let's keep the government open, let's pay our bills, and then let's sit down and have some meaningful negotiation and compromise about federal spending. I'm somebody in my caucus who always is open to other ways that we can cut spending. Some in my caucus don't feel as strongly as I do about that. But I'm willing to listen to all sides and negotiate around a budget. But let's don't hold our economy hostage in the process. Real people are going to be hurt here. This isn't just about who's on the Sunday morning shows, who's your primary opponent, what are they saying on cable news. This is about real folks, and we need to be focused on them. And so I implore you, Speaker Boehner, let your members vote. Just let them vote. Put it on the floor. You can do it in an hour. Put it on the floor and let them vote. And if it's defeated, well, then let's talk. But I'll bet you a cup of coffee it won't be. Thank you. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Colorado.
Mr. President, I believe that the Deficit Neutral Disaster Relief Act that Senator Bennett and I have drafted is at the desk, and it is my understanding that both sides have cleared the bill. I would have to add, after a lot of pushing from Senator Bennett and me and many other Coloradans, along with the governor and the Colorado Department of Transportation. So I therefore ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of Senate Bill 1560, introduced earlier today by Senators Udall, Colorado, and Bennett, that the bill be read 3 times and passed, and the motions to reconsider be made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, if I might, I'd like to make a few minutes of remarks and to thank my colleagues and once again outline what this important act that we just passed will do. It is critically important. I was on the floor Friday. I know the presiding officer was here Friday and was patient and listened to the case that Senator Bennett and I made at that time. This is critically important because it will allow Colorado to begin rebuilding our battered roads and bridges and highways without having to wait years for relief. We're really close now to getting this legislation to the President's desk, and I look forward to working with my colleagues in the House, with Senator Bennett, to get this law, this bill, I should say. It will be a law soon, we hope. This bill signed into law as soon as possible. As I mentioned, Senator Bennett and I have been to the floor on a number of occasions in recent days to highlight how devastated certain parts of our beautiful state are as a result of these biblical floods that we suffered just a few weeks ago. Many communities are just now beginning to comprehend how serious the damage is and to see firsthand how many hundreds of miles of highways and roads, bridges, and other parts of our infrastructure are ruined or in some cases even washed away entirely. I've had occasion to see this damage firsthand on many occasions in the last few weeks, starting in my own neighborhood, which was evacuated, but all over the northern Front Range. I was in Jamestown, as was on Saturday. Senator Bennett was there a few days earlier. And it's one of the worst hit communities in Boulder Canyon. It's almost beyond description when I come to the floor to explain what I saw and what happened. Their homes were literally washed off their foundations. Cars were embedded in the ground, buried, completely buried. Families were left with, in some cases, 2 to 3 feet of mud and silt and river cobbles literally inside their homes. I was in one home in Jamestown, and standing on the mud and silt. I think Senator Bennett may have been there as well. My head was touching the ceiling because of the 3 feet of debris that was inside that house. We've seen entire roads and highways completely decimated. And without this help, it's a fact that communities will not be able to rebuild. So by passing the Deficit Neutral Disaster Relief Act, we've lifted the statutory cap of $100 million to a limit of $450 million. And that money applies to highway relief. So it'll be enough to help us rebuild swiftly. Now, I want to make it clear before and make it clear, as I've done before, make it clear again here that this isn't new money. It doesn't increase budget authority or increase net outlays. It simply allows us to access an already existing appropriated fund of money. Now, historically, this $100 million cap on relief has routinely been recognized by Congress as an unwise impediment to helping states recover. And it's been raised for nearly every natural disaster in recent years. Examples would be familiar to anybody listening. We raised the cap on transportation disaster relief for Hurricanes Gustav, Ike, Irene, Sandy, and as well during the Missouri River Basin flooding in 2011. So I'm truly appreciative and truly grateful that all of our colleagues have come together to recognize that the floods in Colorado are no exception. We're all in this together when it comes to responding to natural disasters, and I'm glad that today we can say to Coloradans that members of Congress from all across the United States of America have stood with us in our recovery efforts. We will stand with them in their recovery efforts as we have done in the past and when we experience future natural disasters. So again, I want to thank the Senate for clearing this crucial legislation. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor and look forward to the remarks of my colleague and friend, Senator Bennett.
Mr. President.
Senator from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will be brief because I think Senator Udall has covered it very well, but I also wanted to rise today on this floor to thank all of our colleagues, all 100 of them, that were necessary for getting this done, for getting it passed, and we've got to move it along to the President's desk. There are a lot of times when people wonder whether anybody in this place is listening to them at home and whether we're doing something other than just playing politics with each other. This is a clear case where people here have listened to the people in Colorado who have generously, from time to time, helped people in other states that were confronting disasters. Now it's our turn to ask for help, and that help's been granted. So I want to thank Senator Udall for his leadership in particular, but also all the members of the Senate that made this possible. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Suggest the absence of a quorum. Clerk.
Mr. President.
Senator from Colorado.
Thank you. I ask unanimous consent that all quorum calls during the period of morning business be charged equally to both sides. And then I would suggest the absence of a quorum.
Without objection, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
And in the Senate, in a quorum call now, they held a roll call vote right after gaveling in, taking up the funding bill immediately, and then voting to table that bill. That bill was voted along straight party lines, all 100 senators voting, and they killed the bill that had been sent over by the House. Politico's reporting over in the House, Republicans are now working to put a bill on the floor that would delay the health care individual mandate and cancel health insurance subsidies for members of Congress and the administration. That's according to multiple sources talking to Politico. That bill in the House would be attached as part of the continuing resolution to fund the government, and the Senate would then have to agree to it, though the Senate just rejected the House last bill, which would have delayed the health care law for a year and would do away with taxes on medical devices. Again, the government on track to shut down at midnight, and as Politico points out, this new move by the House would all but ensure that occurs. We're going to take a And while they're in a quorum call here, we are going to look at some of the tweets coming across from members of Congress.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask